What is going on, y'all? Robert Sykes, KetoSavage.com, and welcome to another AMA Ask Me Anything episode. This one is all about volume versus intensity for building muscle. But before we dive into that, let's roll the intro. All right, we are back. This question is brought to us by a Christian, and they ask, for muscle building on keto, do you prefer doing high intensity to muscle failure, low volume, or low intensity, high volume for muscle building on keto? All right, great question, Christian. Honestly, I prefer a mix of the two. That may sound a little bit vague, but let me kind of explain here. So when you've got really high intensity, really low volume, that's kind of like powerlifting in a sense. So you may be doing 1 or 2 reps at a really heavy weight. That's pretty much the utmost that you can do. So you're going to be going all out, redlining it, and you're going to be just going as far as and as fast and as hard as you can for that very small amount of repetitions. Again, kind of like powerlifting, 1, 2, 3 reps. When you look at the volume of that, which is defined as being the weight times the number of reps times the number of sets. If you're only doing that for a very small number of repetitions, maybe only for one set, the total volume may not be that high. But for a single rep, it's a very heavy weight. Now, if you look at lower weight, higher volume movements, like maybe let's just do deadlift, for instance. If I'm doing a set of 455 pounds on deadlift, conventional deadlift, I'm only going to hit that for a few reps, and that would yield a relatively low total volume compared to if I was doing 225 pounds for just an obsessive amount of reps. That would yield a higher volume, but it'd be less intense because I'm not having to push as hard to pull the 225 as I am that 455. So you've got this debate between total volume lifted versus intensity of that volume that you lift. And when you look at this through the lens of natural bodybuilding specifically, you most often see people pointing towards volume as being the end-all, be-all for hypertrophy and muscle growth. And volume is incredibly important. I'm not going to downplay that at all. Volume is probably one of the single most important things. But there is definitely a point of diminishing returns. For that same deadlift example, I can put, a 45-pound plate on each side, 135 pounds total, and do that all day long. And my total volume doing 135 pounds would be exponentially higher than what I'd be doing with 225, 315, 405, 455. Is that superior than heavier weights for less total volume, even if total volume's higher? I don't think so. I honestly don't, because I think intensity plays a massive role in eliciting more muscle growth. Your body has to be subjected to a significant stimulus in order to be compelled to grow more muscle tissue. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of, stimuli subjected if you're doing 135 pounds all day long, but that's not really going to be optimal. And honestly, that's not really how I prefer to train. Most people probably would not prefer to train that way either. It's going to take a lot more time to do that higher volume at a much lower weight than you'd be able to do a more intense movement with a heavier weight. You're going to be much more efficient with that heavier weight in a shorter period of time. I also just like simply training hard and heavy. I like doing supersets, drop sets, forced reps, all that intensity style movements. It makes me feel like I'm accomplishing something. I like feeling totally tanked and going to failure. And I can do that better if I'm going a little bit heavier and incorporating some of these intensity tactics like the drop sets, supersets, et cetera, et cetera. So that said, I'm not really a fan of doing the extremely heavy 1 or 2 rep sets like in powerlifting because I don't really get the blood flow. I don't really get all the benefits that come from some of that higher volume training load either. So I like to blend the two, so to speak, and I'll typically operate in a 8 to 12 rep set, and I'll sometimes go heavier and do fewer reps like 4 to 6. But honestly, that sweet spot seems to be 8 to 12. Now, with my primary compound movements like the bench, squats, deadlift, overhead press, etc., I'll oftentimes do several sets because it takes quite a bit of time to pyramid up to that heavier or heaviest set in weight. I don't want to risk injury, so I'll just gradually stair-step that up. So by the end of it all, I may be doing that 455, for example, for a few reps, but I've done several sets in warming up prior to that. That all counts towards my total volume lifted. So I kind of like blending the two. I like training for volume. I like doing a lot of higher rep sets. Sometimes I'll go crazy and throw a 30 rep set in there. But I also like doing really hard, heavy lifting, as heavy as I can safely, and throwing in some drop sets, supersets, and more intensity-based movements in there. It all works, so I don't really recommend the extreme component of either the volume or the intensity without a healthy blend of the two. You want to have kind of both, honestly, I think, from an optimization of total muscle hypertrophy standpoint. So I would try and shoot somewhere in the middle there, which in general terms winds up being that 8 to 12 rep range that most of us are quite familiar with anyway. So hopefully that answers your question. Also, on top of all of this, you have to ask yourself, which style of training do you find most sustainable and enjoyable in the first place? Like that may be the best optimal way, but if you're somebody that just doesn't find that sustainable because you really, really like the powerlifting style, or you really, really like higher rep sets, you got to kind of ask yourself, what are you going to be able to sustain for the long haul? Because at the end of the day, what you're able to enjoy and sustain is going to yield the most muscle growth over time, and you don't want to burn yourself out on it. So you have to kind of throw that aspect into the equation as well. So again, hopefully that answers your question. Thank you so very much for the question, Christian. You requested some cookies and cream crunch keto bricks, so I'm going to be sending some of those your way. Again, for those of you that do not know, if you submit a well thought out question via the Google form in the description below, and I use your question on these AMA videos, I will send you some free keto bricks with a flavor of your choosing. Thanks again, Christian. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time.